Our story this morning is about a young boy who became Prime Minister of Egypt, but whose life and career almost came to an end before it began. Like so many other stories in our scripture, this one is surrounded by legend and myth, but in many ways, and in an important sense, it's true. It's true because it helps explain life as well as God's method of operation in the world. When Joseph was young, his father, Israel, or Jacob, gave him a beautiful long-sleeved coat. Remember those stories in Sunday school? We used to call it the robe of many colors. Remember that? He gave him a beautiful long-sleeved coat. Why? Because he was his favorite son. It was a valuable gift, and it was considered a badge of privilege. From what we can gather, Jacob spoiled Joseph, and the boy became an insufferable brat. His arrogance and self-righteousness was so great that his brothers finally decided to kill him. And they would have, had it not been for another brother named Reuben, who talked them out of it. They put Joseph in a pit. Eventually he was discovered by people in a traveling caravan, taken to Egypt, sold into slavery. His brothers told their father that he had been accidentally killed. Now his biography from that point, which concerns his experiences as a slave, his temptations, his rise to power, and his growing devotion to God, is unrivaled for excitement and moral example in the Old Testament. It's a marvelous story, and I want to quickly share with you a few insights about that story because it speaks to our lives individually and corporately. Individually and corporately, in a very significant way. For one thing, and listen to this. For one thing, it reminds us that our greatest blessings usually present us with our sharpest temptations. Let that sink in. Individually and corporately. Our greatest blessings usually present us with our sharpest temptations. That vision isn't original with me. It's part of the biblical perspective. But it's one that we need to hear over and over and over. Consider Joseph's situation. He was more than his father's favorite. He had talent. He really did. He wasn't a dumbbell. He knew what was going on. He was a popular leader, a top-flight administrator when he rose to power under Egypt's Pharaoh. But early on, he was arrogant, prideful about his place in the family, and that got him into serious trouble. The same thing happens to us collectively and individually. Our blessings become our greatest temptations. Not long ago, one of our perceptive senators said this: "It's a seeming psychological need of the bigger and stronger nations like our own to prove that they are bigger and stronger. Along with this usually goes the assumption that force is the ultimate proof of superiority and that being powerful means that we are virtuous." in a variety of ways. That happens on a personal level. The student who is blessed with a high IQ is tempted to slight studying and get by with his wits. The woman who is very beautiful is tempted to take relationships for granted because she is the focus of so much attention. The man born into wealth. Notice I said born into wealth. The man who is born into wealth is tempted to assume that he's a self-made, rugged individualist. And only if everybody would pull themselves up by their own bootstraps like he did, why they might be as financially successful as he is. The Christian who has had an exceptional religious experience is tempted to think that he's more loved by God than someone who has not had a similar experience. And thus, that is proof to him that he is special. And the temptation is to become very sanctimonious about that. The point here is that we need always ask this question: what are my talents? And what are my gifts? What are my blessings? Then beware, because our greatest blessings are indeed our greatest temptations. Another thing about Joseph's story, it shows that one of the best safeguards against the arrogance of blessings is to bear in mind that we live in a constantly changing world. Let that sink in. It's not an amazing insight. We know it. But we need to think more seriously about it. We live in a constantly changing world. Don't say that that's simple and obvious and tune me out. There is something here that stimulates spiritual growth. It's strange and ironic the way the tables of life are constantly turning. It's strange and unusual how that happens. There's an ebb and flow in the tide of human affairs for nations, political parties, and individuals. No one dominates the scene forever. Just as people are not apt to allow themselves to be dominated forever. In an article I saw in a news magazine a few weeks ago, there's a quote from Cesar Perales, who is president of Latino Justice. And he's talking here in this article about the malaise that we are experiencing in so much of our country. And there are lots of things that go into this. But listen to what he says in this article. That malaise, that anxiety, is rooted not just in America's economic troubles, but in its demographic transformation. Large numbers of Latinos, particularly darker-skinned Latinos, are coming into our country, and having a black president causes many Americans to have anxiety because their world has changed. It has changed. At one point in his life, Joseph was at the mercy of his brothers. He was at their mercy. They put him in a pit. Later, as the prime minister of Egypt, circumstances conspired to put him in a situation where they depended upon him for their survival. That's in the Bible. That's what it's about. Now, if you go back through history, you'll discover that power doesn't stay in one place or with one nation or with one system or even with one individual. The point here is quite simple, yet one we should never forget. When we find ourselves in a position of advantage and superiority, we need to remember that the tables of life have a way of turning. And why should we keep that in mind? Because it will help temper our arrogance and make us more sensitive, compassionate people, the kind of people God intends us to be. Now a final thought. It takes a special measure of grace to wear any coat of privilege, and what we really worship will make the difference in how we wear it. And let me say parenthetically, I know we live in a post-Christian era, in spite of the fact that there are some mega churches in the United States and Canada, and there's church growth in Africa. The fact of the matter is we live in a post-Christian world, and we are going to have to learn how to deal with that. The tables of life turn as they've turned before. And so this final thought, those of us who are in one way or another have worn the coat of privilege and perhaps continue to wear it in some respects, need to have a measure of grace to wear it, and what we really worship will make the difference in how we wear it. Joseph didn't learn that lesson until he almost lost his life. As a pampered young man, he managed to avoid his share of responsibility. He didn't do all the work that his brothers did. His brothers are out there taking care of the flock, and Joseph was sitting back there on his backside, resting. He'd tell lies about them and get them into trouble. He'd dream egotistical dreams, imagining that he was the big shot, and everybody was bowing down to him. Then he had the nerve to tell them about it in the presence of Jacob. The brothers always had to take a back seat. And it's no wonder they got jealous of him and they wanted to kill him. And how does that speak to you and me? How does it speak to our country or to Americans by and large? Well, we're among those who are in a favored position in this world. And we have been, and in some respects still are, the ones who wear a coat of privilege. I'm not just talking financially here, but we still wear the coat of privilege. I'm not suggesting or implying that we should feel guilty about that, nor should we feel guilty when life seems to be going our way, as long as it's not going our way at the cost of other people. Moreover, we shouldn't be embarrassed by our talents and abilities. But I am saying that the coat of privilege can be worn in many ways. It can be worn to the glory of God or to the exaltation of our own egos. We can use what we have to help change conditions in the world that cause or contribute to misery and suffering. Or we can use our gifts to feed our greed, irrational fears, and prejudices. We can keep bowing to our culture. Our culture whose God is really money. Or we can kneel to the biblical injunction to those whom much is given, much is required. And I'll tell you this, whatever we do will be largely determined by what we really worship or by that around which our lives truly revolve. The famous theologian Reinhold Niebuhr put it this way. Listen to this. There have been people who have resisted temptations, those who have given sacrificially of their substance to meet the pressing needs of others, those who have told the truth when a lie would have been more convenient and safer. People do these things because of what they are, and what they are is what they put first in life. That is what they worship. And so it is when the tests of life come, as they inevitably will. The results depend upon the kind of God we worship. Well, that's the story of the Jewish boy who became Egypt's prime minister. It's about privilege, jealousy, irresponsibility, and how it undermines divine and human relations. But it's also a story about the grace of God and how it can transform evil into good and assist us to overcome adversity and use our blessings for nobler, more worthwhile ways, especially today. Especially, we need to open our hearts and minds to the Joseph story, because it not only explains how God operates in the world, but it helps us to know how to live in it. Now, let's ready ourselves to share in taking communion and remember the one who knew that story and knew it so well and lived that story. Let us remember him, and we will profit from it. Amen.